Good morning. Impressive. 700 people in a country where almost nobody lives. That's really strange. That's really, I'm really humbled. I wanted to go into the principles today of environmental prevention, so more about the concept of it. It's just to remind about some basics. You know, there is this nice paper by Susan Michie about what are the determinants of behavior and how we can address them in prevention. And there are basically three. It's capability, motivation, opportunity. These three determine our human behavior. So we then target capability means, for instance, our capacity to comprehension, reasoning, all the informational approaches in a way. Motivation can have two parts. The reflective one, where we learn and evaluate consciously, let's say, and the less conscious part, which is the emotions, the impulses, and the association. And the whole question about opportunity, environment, social norms, milieu. What I argue is that classical prevention focuses far too much on these parts only and leaves out the rest. So basically, much of what I'm saying is in this report here, which we have released, I think, this year. Now, one of the first big problems in prevention is that many people believe that it's all about personal responsibility. That's what the alcohol industry tells us all the time. They say it's not a problem of the availability, it's not a problem of us, it's the problem of people who are not able to drink properly. And the cannabis industry says now exactly the same, basically, because you see, this is 1 square of this chocolate bar is what you should eat per day. And they know very well, who of you is able to eat only 1 square of a chocolate bar? If my wife is not around, I eat the whole chocolate bar. And then, according to them, it's my fault, because I'm a non-responsible chocolate eater. And then think about that cannabis increases appetite. So they all go on that thing, it's your fault, it's the individual's fault. It's never our problem. And then they talk about, all the time, in all newspapers, lay newspapers, always come, you shall not prohibit, you shall educate. That's the point. Let's go into the education thing about our eating behavior. You know, there are parts that influence our eating behavior that are inconspicuous, and where the reaction is automatic. And this is what much of research is focusing on. So, but how the hell can you educate for something which you don't realize and to which the response is automatic? And this is a big part of our behavior. I choose eating because everybody does eat and is exposed to that. And then also the second part of the argument. So they all say people should be moderated, we focus on moderation. So if, however, and that came out in The Economist, it's a liberal paper, 2 weeks ago, they say if everybody was drinking responsibly, say only the blue lines, then most of the profit of the alcohol industry would be gone, and they needed to increase prices by 75% or up to 80% in order to have the same benefits. So they profit very well from the fact that what they propose does never work. And basically the same happens in cannabis. It is also 10% of irresponsible users, as they would say, smoke almost all of the cannabis in Canada. The second problem in prevention is this self-illusion we have, or that our decision makers have, to think that you need only to warn people and they would engage in protective behavior. You could educate everybody for all situations to handle risk. It is possible, but not in all situations, not for everybody. And you can appeal to moderation as the industry does. And it has this image, this beautiful image of the individual, which has no impulses, no desires, no emotions, goes out into a disco in order to be moderated. And so it all focus on the prefrontal cortex as if that was a very active part of our brain. And then come out all these studies quite recently that show, yes, people come out with these stories, yes, we drink to the exact point of our maximized pleasure. And then you ask them the weekend after the weekend, and everybody has drunk much more than they had intended to drink. So we tell a lot of nonsense to ourselves and to others, which normally is not true afterwards. Yet, informational approaches are very popular in Europe. We have these fancy maps on our website where the darker a country, the more an intervention is happening. And you see, only information on drugs, very popular in schools. Information days in schools, very popular to be done. Visit of law enforcement agents in schools who talk about drugs and inform them, very frequent. And while we have huge surveys, population-based surveys from several countries saying or concluding that substance users are not only better informed about substances, but have better health literacy than non-users. So empirically, there is not the slightest point of evidence for the protective effects of information provision. Now I wanted to try something with you. Do you want to go in here, go into menti.com and use that code and answer and give me your assessment? I have learned that Swedes don't talk much, so I thought it might be easier if they tip it into their smartphone. Yeah, that's the problem if you do something in Sweden, because my whole presentation is basically breaking through open doors. Because this is normally a presentation I needed to do in Spain or in Germany, but not here, where everybody already thinks like myself. Exactly. You see, normally in other countries, I have to convince everybody that it's not the left end, but rather the right end. So that's the first hint, that you also believe that risk perception is not such an important thing as the other things I'm going to talk now. Here. About your own habits. It's anonymous, so. The point is whether you agree with the first questions, how much you know about where to find carbs, oh, you're faster and faster. Great. I didn't think it would work with so many people. Great. The first question is interpretation of scientific facts. Don't go to that, but lucky, thank you for saving me, because what I expect is exactly that shape. We know a lot, our motivation is a bit lower on that, and our capability of implementing what we know is far lower than this. And that's quite typical. It's what I wanted to show. We all agree on something, but then we have difficulties in implementing it. Oops. Well, I'd rather go back. Now, that's exactly the point where I wanted to get. What drives then our behavior? One thing is descriptive norms, the perception that everybody does something. That's if you get out of a train station in Rotterdam, you know what expects you if you have made the mistake of renting a car. Or you don't have to think, you just see it and you feel it when you see that image. That's also, when you go into that restaurant in Japan, there's no signpost needed. You will most automatically take off your shoes because you will realize what is expected from you. That's the perception of descriptive norms. Everybody does something. and you will follow, most probably. Injunctive norms is this. Imagine an American coming to Berlin, seeing this image and say, oh my God, a naked child with a dangerous animal. After 3 weeks in Germany, she will have realized if there is sun, all Germans get naked. Second, it's normal to expose to kids to some reasonable risks. Also here in France, it is quite clearly stated you should not put your garbage there, but people have decided otherwise, so that it's acceptable to put it exactly below the plate. This is descriptive norm, which is very different from the formal norm. And then you have implicit cognition, our automatic processing of cues. Most people eat 30% more on a buffet because we are primed to eat more and to diversify our food intake. And this implicit cognition is also used by the industries in associating primary stimuli with the things they want us to do or to buy. Oops. This came out of the mouth of an Irish alcohol industry manager, and that's basically a good definition of implicit cognition. They sponsor they focus on 3 things, and the 4th thing they focus with implicit cognition by publicity, what I've just showed you. Another thing, SPAT, just been presented by Ulf. SPAT rarely analyzes the other variables that are there, the perception of parental care, personal significance of rule, poor school performance, on behavior. You see, all this, if you're bad in one of these 3 variables, it increases your risk by 2. But if you think that all of your friends are drinking, it increases your risk of drinking to drunkenness yourself by 10. And what I'm not showing, for cannabis, by 100. So it's the descriptive norm that drives you. Implicit cognition. That's the whole thing about Homo automaticus. So all of us here do daily engage in known harmful behaviors because there is often no reflection about pro and contra. And typical thing, we act automatically, intuitively, follow others, and then we tell a lot of beautiful stories why we did it. We rationalize our behavior. Automatic approach bias to cues is when we follow automatically certain cues that are universal. I get to that. And if you have then additionally deficit in impulse control, you have an additional problem, and this explains vulnerabilities of certain subgroups. So there are studies that are showing that your more fast food outlets are in your way to home from work, or more food outlets in your neighborhood, you will get fatter, eat more. Several studies over time, geographically. So basically what you have is automatic approach bias is if you show that image eye tracking of that photo, women might probably look here first, men would like here first, and heavy drinkers see only that first, and then they screen over the rest of the photo. And that's approach bias. You see that in your children. They see a toy, tiny like that, miles away on the street. The third problem is limited self-control, because all this is nice, as I've just shown about yourself, because there's a lot of things we know, and we do just the contrary every day. And that's also happening in nightlife. There's a nice study also came out really recently this year, and it showed that much of cannabis use, ecstasy use, is frequent. So people go in and say, I want to use this and that. Also, they come in with their own drugs and so, but then they take more than they wanted. So there are a lot of talk about, also about pill testing and to have knowledge about your pills. It's questionable if then many people have a totally unplanned behavior. You know, we all know that our self-control increases linearly over time as we age. So, but this is cold control. In situations where I'm here with you, with my mama, or alone, then my self-control increases over time. But in hot situations, I could talk endlessly, there is a serious stump between 15 and 26 years, where especially adolescents in hot situations do not have any self-control, Basically, they forget in a hot situation like that everything they know about risks and dangers. And that's a very important point. Let's see if it works now. No, I need to get out of there. Yes. So don't do that. I forgot that. So this seems a bit academic. Give it a little thought and try to answer. Ah. Good. I won again. Just go ahead. I wanted to prove you, well, I will show what I wanted to prove you. The second question is this. Which of these two has contributed more to reduction in smoking in the past years? We have heard by all that there was a huge reduction. But when I talk about people in other countries, their judgment is quite different from mine, and as I see, yours as well. Exactly. You seem to agree with me. So we need, after all, that's what I wanted to get to, we need an intervention type that takes into account that we have often automatic decision making, we are not good in self-control in certain situations, and we have a serious lack of introspection about ourselves, who we are and why we do certain things. So what we propose as a definition or as a theory behind environmental prevention is, first it looks simple. You change the regulatory, economic and physical environments, and this changes behavior. Nice, makes sense, nothing exciting. But what we also posit is that these changes happen because these prevention measures change the social context. They change behavioral norms, they change beliefs and values, they change attitudes. So you can act less or differently in a certain form, and this changes your attitudes. Let me explain this better. Smoking used to be something glamorous and funny and special and stylish some few years ago. Now it's something that people do who are caged in an airport. So basically it's quite clear, that's why I like these glass cases, because it shows quite clearly we have another kind of drug addict here, simply. It's okay, everybody's entitled to, but it has taken all the glamour away. And this is, as you agree with me, this has changed attitude and behavior. So the change in behavioral options has changed the attitudes towards smoking nowadays. There will always be an American, a US politician who will come up with that slide to you and with this totally inverted curves between perceived risk and daily use. And they will also always say, even Nora Volkov, thanks, that we need to work on the risk perception. These people, they smoke a lot when there is low risk perception. And I've always been saying all my life, this data could be interpreted the other way around. Because I smoke more cannabis, my risk perception goes down because mostly nothing happens. And if something happens, these people disappear in security and I don't see them anymore. So it's my own behavior that drives the attitude. And now comes out, thanks God, a study last year analyzing the whole data set of the Americans and saying, yes, the most plausible interpretation of this data is that attitude follows behavior. That the attitude follows the own behavior of people. People behave in a certain way because they can, or because of cultural factors that Ulf has nicely hypothesized about. And this changes secondarily as a consequence the attitudes. But most of you, many of you, almost half of you have already answered into that direction. And this is then, and now taking this backwards, that people do things and then interpret their own action as attitudes. And this came up with all these nonsense stories we have heard all over the time. Drinking is a necessary rite of passage, you know, where the Danes took that so seriously that it was been necessary developmental task for kids to drink and to get into drinking as a transition, that they organized parents' parties, parents-kids parties, where the parents would drink with their kids in school in order to introduce them properly in this so important developmental tasks. But it comes out it was all nonsense. It was just something, a posteriori interpretation of the facts, because many people were drinking in adolescence. They were saying this, so this is why it's important for young people to drink, because an important transition. But as Ulf has already said, the same conclusions. There is simply now less pressure, people drink less. So why all this talk about an important developmental task? In Sweden, I always say, in Sweden apparently, are they then less developed because they don't drink in adolescence so much as the Germans do? Now, how to apply this practically? You can drive on the incentives. You can write and say, don't pee on the floor, or you can play with male playfulness and make them target the fly. That's the reason for the fly in the male toilets, if the girls haven't ever seen them. And Joanna has a nice video about it. I don't have time for it. That's a stairway here in, not here, in Stockholm, close to where Joanna lives, and where basically if you go on the stairways, it makes a sound. So why would you be so boring and go the elevator if you can make a sound while going up the stairway? So that's a way that is, people will call me prohibitionist. This is a way playing with incentives. Or you call it choice architecture. You can take the elevator, but it's the more boring option. This is the plant of where I work, of the monitoring center. I'm also the doctor of the monitoring center, and I always say, you can come only to consultations if you come by stairway. Not much effect. That's the beloved elevator, and that's the exit. And then one day they began installing an anti-terrorist door. It never worked, so it took many times, many years, months to have it. And then people, in order to get to their beloved elevator, would need to weigh all around the patio in order to get there. And suddenly, because of that little behavioral twist, people discovered there are stairways. And I was not alone anymore on the stairways. So it changed behavior. There was a possibility to take the elevator, but no need. Other thing, behavioral design, crime prevention. In Medellin, Colombia, you know it was very famous, the cartel and so on, they reduced crime seriously by installing this, I forgot the word in English, where the people from the poorer neighborhoods could get easily, in no time, in the city center and to work. They did it in Rio de Janeiro as well, but without consulting the population, and it did not reduce crime. Well, Rio de Janeiro is anyway a difficult place to change anything. Other places, like if you have open spaces, in such a place, obviously, that's not only the conviviality, but that's also the social control. If you want to steal, rob somebody, it's more difficult than, for instance, in the narrow, dark streets of São Salvador da Bahia in Brazil. Less social control, less visibility. So very simple things you can do with urban design. Street lighting, openness of spaces, niceness of spaces, and so on. Also a very simple thing. We all know the high effect of needle exchange and how it saved Europe from HIV and other transmittable diseases. But what was it? It was simply making needles available. It was not much talking. It was simply the needles that saved it. Another thing, Sao Paulo, Cracolândia, in the center. There were some 30,000 people gathering in the old city center of Sao Paulo, smoking crack all the time. And then they had the idea to offer them simple rewards, kind of to paying them like 50 cents of a euro per day, and giving them some uniforms and some cleaning stuff so they could clean that area and reorganize these rotten houses here into hostels. The idea was purely harm reduction. They just wanted people to have less risky consumption patterns. But the unexpected effect was that people were simply consuming less. And people moved out and did other things because suddenly they had tiny little rewards and some incentives to change behavior. So it was not intended effect of it. Now, we in our publication, we say the focus on environmental prevention is, keywords are exposure, opportunity, work on triggers, on context, on habits, and avoid anything that, well, you can use it, but do not use necessarily all the things that need deliberate and conscious choices. That's the thing between their basic, in behavioral sciences, it's very clear. People who are able to control themselves do that because they avoid triggers. Basically, I can have a bar of chocolate beside my screen all day and use all my resources, my mental resources, this is called agency here below, in order to not eat it. I need a lot of resources to use. Or I could just put a bar of chocolate in the room of my director, where I never go, so the risk is very low that I might eat that bar of chocolate. This is avoiding triggers instead of resisting triggers. And so, keywords are, and we've got the visibility, accessibility, perception of normality, and acceptance. So descriptive norms, subjunctive norms, and so on. And because it uses less agency, it is socially more, how is the word? Equitous. It's more just socially, because we here who sit here, we sit here because we have more agency, because we can control ourselves, we can follow long-term aims, but most people in lower social classes cannot, so they have less agency. So they resist less if they're exposed to a trigger. And now, universal elements, very clear, you know that all, that's boring for you. But the point is, what I wanted to get is to the red part. This has changed already our habits and our so-called culture and our norms. Because now we say between us, tobacco is only for outside. Alcohol is only for inside, even in Spain now. And cannabis only at home, in a very private setting, or in consumption rooms if there are in your country. You have seen the alcohol control scale. It's made by Nordic people. It's a very nice thing. Just showing that's the simple stuff that people associate with environmental prevention. 2008, Nordics were obviously very advanced in it, and then comes 2014, where several other countries have improved as well, except, obviously, Germany. But there are more examples. Regulatory is clear, age reduction, but the physical stuff you might have not been thinking of this. The design of bars and nightclubs, I will go to that tomorrow in the workshop. The size and the shape of the classes. City planning. Minimum alcohol units price, like the Scottish have now. To have the only nice German thing is the alcohol in every establishment in Germany, the cheapest drink has to be non-alcoholic everywhere. To have free water and recreational venues. But now let's get to the thing which is regional and local. In England and in Scotland and in the Netherlands, which have similar communitarian traditions like you, they have done things at local level, which has been well analyzed, and showed that they do reduce problems. For instance, since the power of regulation in England by pressure of the alcohol industry have been put to municipalities, you see, according to the strength of the alcohol regulation in a municipality around England, rates of vandalism, sexual assault have fallen down, a clear dose-response relationship. Now, everybody knows the recent hype about the Icelandic model, isn't it? It's all lay newspapers in the UK, in the US, in the Netherlands, in Spain, everywhere. Everybody talks about it, what is special about it. In reality, nothing. They just do implement what we know as evidence-based principles, like a committed alcohol policy. You can forget half of Europe already. They promote parental monitoring, known to be protective, also the family dinners together, a very committed education policy. They have these leisure time vouchers, meaning supervised leisure time the whole afternoon. But Germans believe that unsupervised leisure time is very important for youth development. I asked them for the evidence, never got one. Strong social norms, and they not invest in any stupid warning mass media campaign, which draws a lot of money. Just to compare, the stupid yearly Italian mass media campaign about illicit drugs takes as much money as Reykjavik spends on these vouchers. But yet, in our exchange registry, what has just been mentioned, We just analyzed, it's not published yet, last week, re-rated the Icelandic model, and it's only here under the rating additional studies recommended because it's only one single Icelandic study that can be used for the rating, and there is no proof that it works in other countries. Now the limitations, it's basically those. It's about narratives. For you it's not a problem here in Sweden, but in other countries, if I have this, it always comes with the criticism. Why can't you let people have fun? Well, because, also from The Economist, by the way, last week, because most of the harm of alcohol is done to others. That's why. Then you tell people what to do in depriving of pleasure. Yes, but did we have a problem to force seating belts, security belts on everyone? If I have no seating belts, I don't harm anybody. Yet I'm forced to do it. So it was never a problem that people tell me what I do in my car. And also, we naturally restrict the prescription of benzodiazepines to doctors only, even if it's a nice thing where you can have fun with. But still, we say, no, only doctors should prescribe it, even if doctors heavily overprescribe, as I saw in a Norwegian study the other day. Also, it's our problem of the narrative. We do not market it so well as the Swedes do market the Systembolaget. We need to tell people that it's not about taking away the beer from the Bavarians, but if we have a proper alcohol industry, we foster hedonism, a proper mindful consumption of a luxury good, and not something that you can buy like water or your daily bread. And this can, and the Icelandics have told me that since they have this restrictive legislation, the local breweries have benefited most from it, because they could much better competition with the big alcohol industry. Now comes the classical argument I have heard in Sweden as well about cross-border purchases. I think it's overemphasized. There are studies between Denmark and Germany, so it's limited to 25 or 50 kilometers, so people need to move to do it. You need to plan, you need to move. That's what we want. Environmental prevention is not about prohibiting, it's about forcing you to plan your behavior and to act and to engage in something. And then came, just a side story, tobacco. Brazil, because many nice stories, because they have such an incompetent government. Now the Ministry of Justice were saying, we need to slap taxes on tobacco because tobacco comes smuggled from Paraguay. Now, this is the border to Paraguay. And that's the size of Brazil. So it's a relationship of 1,000 to 23,000. That's the strength of the argument. I do admit that the black thing is the size of Estonia. It might make a change in Estonia, but the previous study has just showed it doesn't. Most people drink. And also, if it was true, then we would not have these nicely distributed English districts. It would be all diluted, because people would move and buy somewhere else or drink somewhere else. No, they don't, because you need to act and to move. And people simply don't. They do what they can automatically do. And if you limit that a little bit, it changes behavior. And then comes the other argument, what I've just said. It's only 10% of people who do it. So why not just focus on the problem drinkers? As the classical alcohol industry argument. They say, why shall everybody pay for the faults of the few? Well, because of the famous bell curve. The red thing is what you get if you move high-risk people into a better curve. But the green thing is what you get if you move the whole population into a more moderated situation. So you get much more population-based effects. Then, very quickly, I think I'm slightly on the edge of my time. 1 minute, I see. Then, one day, a Spanish, obviously, philosophy teacher wrote me, so certainly not working with low-class kids, and saying me that I was undermining free decision-making, that I was promoting manipulation, authoritarianism, he's Spaniard, obviously, and that education, yes, is everything, because education, yes, that's it. Education is fine, because I can see in Kinderschokolade, I read the thin printing, and I can see that in Kinderschokolade it doesn't neither contain chocolate nor milk. It's only sugar. And I can buy a nice glass of wine, only good one, and drink it. But then he said, yes, but it helps for a boy to get from Barcelona to Prague. And I said, yes, it does. But calculate impulsivity. He might find a very persuasive Colombian on the train and then end up in Cartagena. And this is not a joke. It happens all over the time in America that young boys suddenly end up in Colombia when they were supposed to go elsewhere. And then manipulation. People tell, you shall not manipulate. Really? I mean, everybody here has a smartphone. We have just used it. And it has manipulated our entire professional life and private life. And even we pay for being monitored. And Facebook has decided about, you know, elections in Brazil, in the state, even has made that people go to his country to Olympics. And even Instagram is now paying heavily for people, for influencers to promote alcohol. And cannabis is already on the way. The cannabis industry is doing the very same thing. And also, a nice paper came out this year of how bars basically design environments for drunkenness. So that's it. I can stop here if you want, unless there is the only valid argument that is still left over, which is SBAT studies again, comparing high prevalence countries with low prevalence countries. You see, the green one would be Sweden, the red one would be Spain, where every prevalence is high. Alcohol, be it alcohol, cannabis, or heroin. But the funny thing is that a cannabis user in a low prevalence country like Sweden is much more problematic in the consumption of other drugs and in other psychosocial variables than a consumer of cannabis in Spain, for instance. So you need to be really strange in order to use cannabis in Sweden. Apparently, according to a study that came out this year again, this effect is decreasing. But still, it's a dilution effect. If water was the problem, the huge icebergs, you hardly see them in the whole flood of water. That's Spain. And this is Sweden. Almost no water, but the icebergs, the tiny iceberg or pieces of ice that are there are very visible. That's a cannabis user in Sweden. So basically, environmental prevention, its limit is that it doesn't work well in highly vulnerable people. You need to target them specifically. I skipped that. That's too long. So if you can't sleep tonight, reflect when people outside of Sweden talk about culture and alcohol culture, and when even the nonsense of the cannabis culture. Culture is something which is a construct. We have constructed based on our own habits. We do something for sufficient time, and then we define it as a culture. Because it's also Bavarian dress. They market it like hell as millennial culture. It's nonsense. All this stuff is from the 1850s. It's 150 years old. These kind of things. People were used to use that. It was put into the market to a certain moment, and then people assume it as culture, and since then it's being defended as something you should not meddle about because it's culture.